A dying German soldier is lying in a burning street. He sees the British officer walking toward him through the smoke, and he raises his hand, not to surrender, not to fight, to shake hands. The British officer, the man who planned and executed one of the most precisely engineered raids of the entire Second World War, stopped, reached down and shook it. That moment happened in a Norwegian fishing town most people alive today couldn't find on a map. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. It appears in no official dispatch. No headline covered it. But I think it tells you more about what war actually is than almost anything else in this story. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why that moment happened, what it cost to get there, and how the events of that single morning forced Adolf Hitler into one of the most expensive strategic miscalculations of the entire war. One that would echo, silently, all the way to the beaches of Normandy. Stay with me, because this story has a twist in it that almost nobody talks about, and it starts not with glory, but with the smell of burning fish oil and white phosphorus at the bottom of a Norwegian fjord. Before we talk about what happened, we need to talk about the one thing that made it possible. Not courage, not firepower, not numbers, time, specifically, the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of time. Because Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford-Slater understood something about raiding a defended coastline that most commanders took years to learn. The moment your first man hits the beach, you're already losing. Not to the enemy, to the clock. Surprise is not a condition, it's a commodity, and it expires. Every minute you spend ashore is a minute the enemy spends recovering his aim, recovering his communications, recovering the organisational will to fight back. And once that happens, a raiding force in a fjord stops being a strike team and starts being a target. So Durnford-Slater built his entire operation around one idea: move faster than the enemy can think. His men practiced landing drills every single morning, over and over, until the motion became unconscious, until 30 men could leave a landing craft, cover the open ground to the nearest cover, and be down and protected in 10 seconds. 10 seconds sounds small. In a defended landing zone, 10 seconds is the difference between a casualty and a corpse. But here's the thing. Here's what nobody could rehearse. The plan they'd spent weeks perfecting was already wrong in one critical way, and they were about to find out how wrong, in the worst possible place, at the worst possible moment. But first, why were they here at all? If you look at a map, South Vågsøy makes no sense as a military target. It's a small Norwegian port, a fishing town, tucked into a fjord system on the western coast of Norway, 350 miles from Scotland across open North Atlantic water in late December, in the dark. So why is Britain sending one of its most powerful light cruisers, 4 destroyers, RAF bomber support, and its most elite ground troops to hit this specific dot on the map? The simple answer is fish oil. The factories at Vågsøy processed and stored fish oil that fed directly into German explosives manufacturing. Every barrel that burned there was one less barrel, contributing to the ammunition killing Allied soldiers somewhere else. The German convoy system used the area as an assembly point. Destroying the shipping infrastructure there wasn't symbolic, it was surgical, but the real answer goes much deeper than fish oil. And it involves a question that kept British planners awake at night in late 1941. Can we actually do this? Not this raid specifically, something much larger. Britain was already thinking about the day when the war would turn, when defence became offence, when the Channel would have to be crossed, when an army would have to be put ashore on a hostile European coast and kept there long enough to matter. Could a naval bombardment be precisely timed to suppress shore defences without killing the troops following behind it? Could smoke be deployed from the air to mask a landing without the wind turning it into a death trap? Could 3 military services, Navy, Air Force and ground troops, be compressed into one single coherent strike package that actually worked under fire? Nobody knew, not for certain, not until someone tested it. Vågsøy was the test. What the men in those landing craft didn't know, couldn't know, was that they weren't just carrying explosives and grenades that morning. They were carrying the proof of concept for the largest amphibious invasion in history. But proof of concept requires proof. And what was waiting for them in South Vågsøy was about to make that proof far more expensive than anyone had anticipated. The force that moved into that fjord in the early hours of December 27th, 1941 was not improvised, it was engineered. HMS Kenya led the column, a cruiser powerful enough to reduce a shore battery to rubble in minutes, fast enough to close the distance before the enemy could organise. Alongside her came 4 destroyers, lean and quick, their guns elevated toward the Norwegian hills. 2 converted ferries carried the landing force, and ahead of all of them, invisible beneath the dark water, a submarine had spent the night in position, a navigational beacon, a fixed point in a featureless sea to make sure the entire force arrived exactly where it needed to be. 5 separate landing groups, each with a specific target, each with a specific time. They were each timed against the others so that the defenders couldn't reinforce one point without abandoning another. Group 1, a strong point 2 kilometres south of town. Group 2, the southern edge of the town itself. Group 3, the island battery, the guns that could destroy everything if they weren't silenced first. Group 4, held in reserve on the water, ready for the moment the plan stopped working. Group 5, the northern road, block the reinforcements before they can reach the fight. From the outside to anyone watching from the shore, what arrived in that fjord must have looked like chaos. Ships moving in different directions, smoke erupting from the water, landing craft appearing from multiple angles simultaneously. It wasn't chaos, it was a machine running exactly as designed. And at 7:39 in the morning, when the submarine appeared on the surface right where it was supposed to be, the machine began to move. At 8:48 a.m, a star shell tears the Norwegian sky open. What follows is 9 minutes of violence so concentrated and so precisely calibrated that it's almost impossible to describe without reducing it to the technical language it deserves. Kenya and the destroyers opened fire on the battery at Malloy Island. The guns that could sink every vessel in the fjord, the guns that have to be destroyed before anything else can happen. Shell after shell falls on the battery positions. The island disappears behind smoke and debris. Then, at 8:57, the firing stops. 1 minute later, 3 RAF Hampden bombers come in so low over the water that Durnford-Slater later said they appeared to be flying at 0 feet. They drop their smoke bombs. White phosphorus erupts across the surface of the fjord, a curtain of chemical fire between the landing craft and the shore. Some of the phosphorus blows back. A great flaming sheet of it, Durnford-Slater wrote, came back toward the ships. This was not movie fog. This was a technical device that could kill the men it was designed to protect, and it was deployed anyway, because the alternative, landing on an unsuppressed shore, was worse. Behind that curtain of fire and smoke, the landing craft are already moving, and on Malloy Island, the bombardment has done its work. The guns are wrecked, the garrison is shattered. By 9:20, just 32 minutes after the first shell fell, the island battery is in British hands. The channel is open. The first phase of the plan has worked almost perfectly. Yeah, which is exactly when South Vågsøy tears the script apart. The British expected resistance in South Vågsøy. They'd planned for it. They'd rehearsed for it. What they hadn't planned for, what no intelligence report had told them, was who was waiting for them in those streets. The town wasn't just garrisoned by standard occupation troops. Among the German soldiers resting in South Vågsøy that December were mountain troops, Gebirgsjäger, men who had spent months fighting on the Eastern Front in some of the most brutal conditions the war had produced. Men who knew how to find cover, how to create fields of fire, how to make an attacker pay for every yard. The official British dispatch used a phrase to describe what the Commandos encountered in that town. Not fierce resistance, not determined defence. The language is more precise than that, more unsettling. Severe in degree and skillful in quality. Skillful. These men were not fighting desperately, they were fighting intelligently, using windows as firing positions, using buildings as strong points, making the British earn every doorway. And so the raid transformed. The amphibious operation, the timed, rehearsed, clockwork machine, dissolved into something else entirely. Room by room, stairwell by stairwell, the gap between 2 burning buildings, the angle of a window on the 2nd floor. This was not what the training had prepared them for. There is no drill that teaches you how to clear a house where the man inside has already survived a Russian winter. 3 British officers fell within minutes of each other. Not in a dramatic charge, not in some cinematic moment of heroism, in the grinding, close personal violence of urban fighting where skill meets skill and someone loses, and at the centre of all of it, one building. The Ulversund Hotel had been turned into a fortress. German soldiers held it from multiple floors. They had sightlines on the approaches, they had cover and ammunition, and every minute that building held was a minute stolen from a schedule that had no minutes to spare. Captain Algy Forrester reached the entrance with a live grenade in his hand. He was shot before he could throw it. Captain Dennis O'Flaherty came next. A sniper found him. He survived, but he would spend the rest of his life with one eye. And then Captain Martin Ling, Norwegian officer, the man whose name would eventually be given to the most celebrated Norwegian military unit of the entire war. He went at the hotel, and he didn't come back. Stand in that street for a moment. Not on a map. In the street. Smoke drifting between the buildings. The sound of fire from multiple directions. 2 officers already down. A building that isn't breaking. And a clock on the wall that doesn't care about any of it. What do you do? Captain Bill Bradley looked at the hotel. He looked at the 3-inch mortar his crew was carrying. He looked up at the roof, and he elevated the mortar almost vertically. What followed was not in any training manual. Rounds dropped nearly straight down, through the chimney line, into the rooms where the defenders were sheltering. The building caught fire, the resistance broke. It worked not because it was in the plan. It worked because the man holding the mortar could think when the plan had stopped working. That is the real lesson of Vågsøy. Not the rehearsals, not the timestamps, not the official dispatch language. The lesson is that you can engineer a raid down to the minute and still end up needing a man who can solve a problem that didn't exist until 30 seconds ago. By midday, the town was almost clear. Wounded men were being carried through the same streets where the fighting had happened an hour before. Civilians who had helped move ammunition were now helping move casualties. Prisoners, German soldiers, local collaborators, were being organised on the quayside. And 77 Norwegian volunteers, men who had been waiting for exactly this moment, were boarding the landing craft to be taken to Britain and trained to fight. At 12:50, Durnford-Slater gave the order to re-embark. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the deadline they'd been given when they left Scotland, the entire force was gone. 6 hours, from the first shell to the last boat. In those 6 hours, 4 factories had burned. Fuel stores, ammunition stores, a telephone exchange, gone. 8 enemy ships destroyed or captured. Installations across the port wrecked. The British lost 17 men killed, with more than 50 wounded. The Germans lost around 150 dead, with over 100 taken prisoner. By any accounting, the raid succeeded. The clock held. The schedule recovered. The machine, battered and bloodied, ran to completion. But what happened next is the part that nobody on those boats could see. What happened next happened in Berlin. Adolf Hitler had already said it, on the record, in writing. Norway was, in his own words, the zone of destiny in this war. He believed, with a conviction that bordered on obsession, and that several of his generals privately thought was irrational, that Britain would eventually strike Norway in force, that the northern coast, the iron ore routes, the access to the Arctic supply lines, made it a target the Allies couldn't resist forever. He was wrong. Britain had no plans to invade Norway in force, but Hitler didn't know that. And on December 27th, 1941, what arrived in his intelligence reports only confirmed what he already feared. A defended port hit in broad daylight, shore batteries silenced by naval gunfire, factories destroyed, shipping sunk, prisoners taken, volunteers evacuated, and the attackers, clean withdrawal, gone before the afternoon was over. For a mind already convinced that Norway was where the decisive blow would fall, this was not a nuisance. This was a demonstration. The British had just proved they could strike anywhere on that coastline, at a time of their choosing, with precision and force, and Hitler's response was everything the British could have hoped for, and more than they'd dared to plan. He poured troops into Norway, tens of thousands of additional men, fortress battalions, coastal gun emplacements multiplied along hundreds of miles of shoreline, and then, in a move that stunned even some German naval commanders, he ordered his most powerful surface ships north. Tirpitz, the mightiest battleship in the German fleet, sent to Norway to guard against an invasion that was never coming. Scharnhorst, Vågsøy, Admiral Hipper, Prinz Eugen, ships that could have threatened the Atlantic supply lines, that could have complicated the Mediterranean campaign, that could have done real, tangible damage to Allied operations, locked in Norwegian fjords, waiting, watching a coast for an enemy that wasn't coming, and it compounded year after year. because Hitler never stopped believing. Every subsequent British raid reinforced the fear. Every commando operation on the Norwegian coast added another brick to the wall of anxiety in Berlin. By the summer of 1944, by the time the real invasion came, not in Norway but in Normandy, the German garrison in Norway had grown to nearly 400,000 men. 400,000 soldiers, standing guard on empty beaches, consuming food, ammunition, fuel, transport, command attention, all of it pulled away from fronts where Germany was bleeding and desperate for every man. The Allied force that landed on D-Day was roughly the same size. Think about that. Germany had pinned down a force equivalent to the entire Normandy invasion force, in the wrong country, for the better part of 3 years. Not because of a grand deception operation, not because of years of strategic planning designed specifically to create that outcome, because of 6 hours in a Norwegian fishing town, because Durnford-Slater's clock held. And now we're back to where we started. Durnford-Slater is walking through the smoke and wreckage of South Vågsøy. The fighting is over, the withdrawal is beginning. The machine has run to completion. And a dying German soldier lying in the street raises his hand. Durnford-Slater stops. He reaches down. They shake hands. 2 men on opposite sides of a war, in the ruins of a town that neither of them will ever forget, sharing the only honest acknowledgement available to them. I was here. So were you. We both understand what this cost. That moment isn't in the official dispatch. It doesn't appear in any strategic analysis of Operation Archery. It didn't affect the tonnage count or the prisoner tally or the German reinforcement numbers or the trajectory of the war in Norway. But it is the truest thing that happened that day, because it reminds us that the machinery of war, no matter how precisely engineered, no matter how well rehearsed, and no matter how strategically brilliant its outcomes, is operated by human beings. Men who can recognize each other, even while the buildings around them are burning. Martin Linger died in a hotel doorway. Dennis O'Flaherty lost an eye on a Norwegian street. 17 British commandos went to Norway in December 1941 and didn't come home. And somewhere in Berlin, a man who called Norway the zone of destiny stared at his maps and began moving pieces that would never find the battle he was looking for. That is what 6 hours of carefully applied violence actually looks like, once the smoke clears and the boats are gone and the historians start counting. Admiral Horan, writing about Operation Archery years later, made a claim that should stop you in your tracks. He argued that what was learned at Vågsøy about naval bombardment timing, about smoke and suppression, about reserve commitment and timed extraction, was built directly into the doctrine that landed the largest invasion force in history on the beaches of Normandy. Vågsøy wasn't a rehearsal in the metaphorical sense. It was a rehearsal in the operational sense, conducted at full scale, with live ammunition, against defenders who knew exactly what they were doing. The official dispatch said it was executed with great efficiency, precision and boldness. What the official dispatch couldn't capture, what no official dispatch ever can, is the dying man in the street reaching for the hand of the man who beat him, or the moment a British officer stops in the middle of smoke and wreckage and the sound of a battle still winding down around him, and reaches back. If this story stayed with you, if you think these men deserve to be remembered exactly as they were, not as myth, not as propaganda, but as human beings who did something extraordinary and paid for it in the only currency war accepts, press like. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm this history matters. Subscribe, because these stories don't tell themselves. And down in the comments, in one word, tell me what you think that handshake meant. Thank you for watching Bruton in Battle.